Bob is the only coach that I've ever had. He had trained me, punished me, motivated me, inspired me, and proved to me the connection between hard work and success. Bob has long been one of the very few people in my life to tell me the unadulterated truth, even when I didn't want to listen. Perhaps most important, especially when I didn't want to hear it. That's Michael Phelps on his coach, Bob Bowman. So outside of athletes, coaches might be the most important figures in all of sport. Often they start as parents or non-professionals, and eventually they often evolve into people who coach full-time. Michael had one coach for his entire career, under that being Bob Bowman. But other athletes like Tiger Woods or Roger Federer have had many coaches throughout their careers. Coaches also vary in individual skill acquisition as well as in team management. In this episode, we're going to try to answer what is the role of a coach. We're going to specifically focus on individual coaches for team management, not coaches that lead teams. We're going to do a separate series on that in the future. We're going to focus on what is the breadth of value a coach can offer to an athlete. As part of this discovery, we're also going to look into how coaches and athletes can communicate together with each other, as well as build trust. At the end of this episode, we're going to examine what the role of the athlete is themselves, obviously after we laid the groundwork with discussing what the role of the coaches is. This is part 3 of my 4-part series on Michael Phelps. If you're new to the Exponential Athlete podcast, this is a show where I try to take deep dives into the greatest athletes of all time, and I complement all of the things that I learn with interviews from experts, other athletes, and technologists, anyone who is leading in this field. With that being said, let's jump in to what the role of the coach is. This is Michael Phelps. I knew this had to be coming one day. Here it was. I'm going with you, I said. After Athens, Bob knew I would have to leave Baltimore for my own personal growth. Maybe at some level I knew too. Hard as it would be to leave my mother and sisters, there's no way I was leaving Bob. He was my coach, yes, but he was also much, much more. A friend, yes, but still more than that. Bob had changed not only how I swam, but who I was as a person, reminding me constantly how much love and dedication he has for the sport and everyone in it. I don't think either one of us, to be honest, could do without the other for any length of time. I certainly wasn't about to try. This is, again, Michael talking about the choice to leave his hometown in North Baltimore to go to Michigan to follow Bob as a coach. He views Bob as so important that he's worth following, leaving his family, leaving everything effectively he knew behind. Michael would go to Michigan. He would be by himself. He'd be on his own for the first time. And Bob was the really important glue that held all of his career together. Bob is also, as a coach, looking at Michael and focusing on things that he doesn't have to. This is Michael on how Bob is focusing on swimming 100% of the time, so he doesn't necessarily have to.
I was very lucky to have a coach that literally worked and thought about swimming 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And he prepared me for absolutely anything, mentally, physically, emotionally, it didn't matter. Because when you go to an Olympic Games, you have to conserve your emotional energy. You know, it's an exciting place to be at, and you know, you have people from all over the world. So, you know, you can kind of get sidetracked or lost in the direction that you're trying to go. So, you know, for me, it was trying to I mean, the process. I guess that's what it was. We were figuring out the process of what we had to do in order to stand up and be able to compete against the best in the world.
As we go into the different roles that a coach can fill, I'm not by any means suggesting that a coach should fill all of these roles. There's multiple different types of coaches. There's skill-specific coaches. There's more integrated coaches like Bob Bowman was. A lot of coaches aren't going to interact in all of these ways. They're just how you could. And maybe how, in some ways, how maybe you should. The first way is in a form of mentorship. So in order to be an effective coach, I really believe that you have to learn and understand each athlete individually. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are the ways that they learn things? How do you motivate them in a unique way? This is an example of Bob not talking with Michael until 8 a.m.
We had an arrangement where we didn't speak to each other before 8 o'clock in the morning because I'm not a morning person. And so, you know, we were able to communicate certain things to make sure that we were able to work the best possible way. So we expressed our boundaries. Were you in the pool
when you were not speaking to each other? I mean, were you you were there, but you wouldn't talk?
I would walk into the pool at 6:30 for a 7 o'clock workout. We could not speak to each other between the hour of, from 6:30 when I stepped on the deck until 8 o'clock, an hour into the workout. That was just something we had to do.
He knows exactly what Michael needs to be able to bring the best out of him each day. I think mentorship is a good way to describe this, because in a mentor-mentee relationship, it isn't just one direction. It is like a friendship where one person is guiding the other more often. I would argue that in every mentor-mentee relationship, the mentor is also learning from the mentee. And I think that this is the case for Bob as well. This is how Michael views Bob, as sort of this mentor. I relied on him for the kind of counsel a father gives a son. In our moments when we weren't yelling at each other, we talked about school, friends, family, girls, music, anything. We didn't see eye to eye on a lot of it. I will never like country music, but he knew, and I knew, that he had done more than mold me into a swimmer. He had helped me to grow, and there were days when I needed a lot of help. Sometimes it's not appropriate for a coach to take a athlete under their wing, but a lot of the times this can help entrench that relationship. It can help establish trust. It can help to convey and get the athletes on the same page if they believe that you have their best interest in mind. I think that's one of the fundamentals of a mentor, is that they clearly have your best interest in mind, and they're going to tell you things that you might not want to hear because it is what is best for you. One of the ways that Bob or other coaches can help to create mentorship is providing frameworks for sport as well as for life. This is Michael on one of the frameworks that he learned from Bob. And we touched on this a little bit in the last episode. Attitude, action, achievement. That was the order in which you could expect things to happen. You could see every day's practice as an ordeal, or you could see it as an adventure. To that end, Bob would always tell me, we become what we think about the most. Are you going to wait until you win a gold medal to have a good attitude? No, you're going to do it beforehand. You have to have the right mental attitude and go from there. You're going to be an Olympic champion in attitude before there's a gold medal around your neck. Bob also had many others. We talked about in the previous episode how he had the framework, the 3 I's for creating a team. There's a lot of these little ways that he packages information that makes it very accessible to Michael. And a lot of these lessons, a lot of these ideas extend beyond sport. A mentor in this case is also there through the hard times. And a coach can be someone that you rely on when things are difficult, when things aren't going well. And in sports, that happens a lot of the time. You don't always play great. You don't always improve. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with coaches where I wasn't playing my best. I couldn't figure it out, and they were there to help guide me through things. This is Michael after his DUI, or one of his DUIs, which was a very low point for him. We went to check on him after I'd moved into Ann Arbor. He knew what had occurred. Look, he said, one of the biggest things I'll tell you is this. Whenever you make a mistake, learn from it. As long as you can learn from every mistake, he said, you'll be fine. You can make 1,000,000 mistakes, just not the same one twice. Now, as it turned out, along with my successes, I've also had setbacks, and some becoming very public ones. In times like these, Bob, coach and friend, stayed with me and mentored me, and most of all, told me to push through a difficult today to set myself up for a better tomorrow. This is sort of like the models we were describing before, but it's also being there in a time of need, saying the right things. And Bob didn't always say the right things, but that's a lesson that he learned from Michael about how to necessarily get over and communicate in a more effective way. Another aspect of mentorship is mutual respect. This is Michael. When Bob and I have our worst arguments, really intense, serious, how did you get to be such a knucklehead kind of arguments? They're over by the next day, sometimes by the next hour, because we know we both want the same things, and because he respects how hard I work, because I respect how much he knows, and because we both realize how much we need each other and can trust each other. We don't hesitate to use each other as an excuse to blow off steam. It's something you can only really do with close friends and family. We're going to talk a little bit about how you build that trust and that mutual respect. But if we're thinking about one of these relationships, I think the first milestone is in building mutual respect is aligning yourself and doing what you say you're going to do, committing to what you do. So if a coach is communicating with you as an athlete and you're listening to what they're saying and you're executing it, even if you have pushback, if you're trying to understand why, that's a reasonable thing. If you're just blowing it off, if you're not doing the things that you're saying you're doing, that's probably going to cause a rift. On the other side, if an athlete is communicating with a coach and the athlete doesn't feel like the coach really believes in what they're saying, they don't feel like they're giving them individualized coaching, attention, things that will genuinely help them. If they don't think that the coach has their best interest in mind, maybe if the coach is in it for the money or something along those lines, then the relationship probably won't reach this level. The last element of mentorship that I think is really important is belief. This is Michael talking about how Bob believed in him and how that really made him believe in himself.
He was somebody who trusted me and somebody who really thought that I could do something I put my mind to, and he believed in me. And I think right then and there, that's what I was looking for, because my parents divorced at a very young age, and he was kind of like a father figure who really believed in me. And I think that was something that I was really looking for then, and I decided to say, okay, let's do it, and we did it together. And I think from that moment forward, we just decided that we could do absolutely anything that we put our mind to.
And belief maybe doesn't come immediately. Belief is something that's created over time. But I think that one of the great things about these relationships is that they can grow and they can evolve over time. I love seeing a relationship like Bob and Michael's because they were able to grow together. A lot of the time when athletes are changing coaches, maybe they're changing because things get stale, because either the coach reaches their limits or the athlete reaches the limits on what they feel like they can learn from the coach. And I don't believe it has to be that way. As a coach, if you're evolving and learning, which we're going to talk about later, I don't think that necessarily has to happen. Related to creating belief, I think the next thing that a next role or responsibility or skill that a coach can impart is outlining what is possible. Michael says, he said I could make not just one Olympics team, but many Olympic teams. And when I eventually got to the Olympics, I would have the chance to win medals. He didn't guarantee anything, but he laid out the possibilities with a good deal of certainty. From a coaching perspective, you don't want to put a cap on your athletes. You want to let them know where their potential lies. And if they execute, if they do the things they're supposed to do, they should hopefully reach that potential. You don't want to set unrealistic expectations, but you want to set ambitious speculations for them. In the back of his mind, Bob was holding out the possibility, no matter how remote it seemed, that I could finish in the top 2 at the Olympic trials that summer in Indianapolis and make the Olympic team. At that point, I had produced nothing to suggest the 2000 Olympics were truly possible. This did not deter Bob. He believed in me completely. So this is when Michael was trying to first make the Olympics in 2000. He did end up making it. The funny thing is that Michael was producing things that did suggest that he could make that team. It just didn't appear like that to him. Afterward, I had my first interview. I was asked, did you think you could break 2 minutes in the 200 fly? Here's what I said. My coach told me I could do it. It's after the 159.6, Bob likes to say, that he knew I would make the Olympic team. Maybe sooner than later. I had no idea. I was, after all, 14. So when Michael isn't able to think about these things, isn't able to gauge his athletic ability, his capabilities, Bob is there to be able to believe in him and instill that belief in him as well. Something that Bob does really well in outlining what's possible, he leaves the possibilities open. Bob says, you can compare Michael to Mark Spitz in that he swims a lot of different events in different strokes at a high level, he said. Now, can he win 7 events, 7 gold medals? That's very difficult to do in this day and age. I can't imagine right now we try an event program that would be that ambitious. Still, Bob said, I'm not going to rule it out. I told the same reporter it might be fun to aim for. It's harder now than it was back then. If you can do it, wow. Bob was having no more wow talk. As soon as the thought of 7 came up, he shoved it right back down. The way to think about 7 medals wasn't to talk about it, it was to train. So Bob is not discounting the capabilities of Michael, the ability to do this, but it's not necessarily what is important in the moment. Bob is leaving that door open for future dates. And I think that that's one of the really effective ways that coaches can communicate with athletes is that, hey, yeah, maybe this could be on the table, but the only way to get there is to focus on the present and focus on what we're doing now, because that is a long-term goal versus a short-term goal. He has also, without question, helped me to believe that anything is possible. 2 seconds faster than a world record doesn't matter. 3 seconds faster doesn't matter. You can swim as fast as you want. You can do anything you want. You just have to dream it, believe it, work hard at it, and go for it. And one of the ways that Bob helps Michael instill a lot of these beliefs is he shows him hitting these times in practice. He shows the work plan, and Michael can clearly see the progress that he's making in practice. And that applies and scales to the events as well. This is how Bob is showing Michael things are possible through hard work. This is an example that Michael likes to use about a coach showing athletes what's possible. This is from his favorite movie, Miracle. Again, after a few dozen agains, Coach Brooks finally let the players go back in their locker rooms. And they knew after that, no matter what the score, it was his job to drive them until they gave their best effort. They knew that no matter what obstacles they faced at the Olympics, even a game against the seemingly unbeatable Soviets, that they had already overcome something more difficult, that night of endless again. So Coach Brooks is essentially making them run the same drill over and over again. They might have hated Brooks for it at that time, but how could they have been good without him? This is Michael himself talking about how Bob is instilling something similar in him.
First workout we did, as the meet's going on, Bob has WR written on the top of the workout. And I'm like, what is this? Like, I know what it means, but like, why are you writing it here? And he's like, because we're going to break a world record in 6 months. I was like, all right.
Decide.
Yeah, let's do it. Cool. I'm in. 6 months later, first world record. 6 months after that, broke another one, won my first world championship. And he just started proving to me that he could get me to these certain places. And we just started pressing the envelope even more. We're like, all right, what do we want to do next? How big can we really take this?
Yeah.
And you know, I remember sitting with my agent when I was 15, 16 years old, and I just said, I want to do something that nobody else has ever done in the sport.
To be honest, this does pull a little bit from the previous section of mentorship and knowing the individual athletes. How can you challenge the athletes correctly? How can you show them that they are capable of specific things if you don't really know them personally and know their capabilities? This is Bob talking about how he had to personally level up to match Michael's skills.
Started the 5/100s on 105, which for 11-year-olds does not happen, right? You know, I see Sid back there. That just doesn't happen, right? They do the first one, and I see Michael move ahead of the guy in front of him, which means he's going on a minute. And then he moved up again, and he moved up again, and he moved up again, and he moved. And the last one, he was in front, which meant he went 5/100s on a minute, 11-year-old. And I remember thinking, play it cool, don't act like you're too excited, right? I was like, okay, nice job. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Michael, maybe you can try harder, you know? But I went home that night, and I was like, oh my God. I was like, I got to step up my game because this kid is already way ahead of me. So I need to learn how to challenge him and come up with a plan. So what I decided on was technique.
I think that some of this is the artistry of coaching as well. So how do you focus on the right area where you can create value for an athlete? So maybe as a technique coach or as a coach, you're not as strong at the physical conditioning. That's just not your knowledge base. As a coach, you can find the right people. You can really focus on how the physical side integrates with the technique. It's indexing on your own specific skill set rather than just trying to do everything for the athlete. The next thing that I believe a coach can do for an athlete themselves is to create accountability and to set standards for the athlete. This is something that I think is one of the most important things for team coaches in particular, because getting everyone on the same page, setting standards for everyone is really important, but this trickles down to individual coaching as well. This is Bob. Nothing's good enough for you. He barked at me more than once. I had to win 8 gold medals to get a good job out of you. Lay off, would you? To a certain extent, he was right. I would never accept anything less than his very best. And when he gave it, I would reset it to a notch above. That's the method's work. So I think that there's a right and a wrong way to do this. So this is after Michael had won in Beijing. This is when he was going into the 2012 Olympics that he really didn't perform very well in by his standards. He admits that he slacked off. And we talked in the past episode about how he wasn't necessarily thinking about the future. How can you one up 8 gold medals to begin with? But there is something I think important about this is, as a coach, your job is to not necessarily set the standards on performance, but set the standards on effort. And Bob is holding Michael to a very high standard of effort. There's a right and a wrong way to do this. I think that you have to celebrate the wins. You have to be able to appreciate the effort that they're putting in, even if it's not their best. But you should be there as a coach to point out when they aren't giving their best effort. Performance in events, those types of things, if everything is done correctly, you can't penalize or fault someone for not executing. You can only fault them for not putting in the right effort. Part of accountability and setting standards is that, for better or for worse, you have to set standards and accountability different for everyone. Tough love is right for some athletes and not right for others. That's it, Michael. Get out of the pool. You're not going to swim another stroke for NBAC, which is the North Baltimore Aquatic Club, until you get set properly. Not another stroke. I was convinced that Bob wasn't serious, and he let it blow over because it was just a throwaway training set and we had races to swim. Wrong again. Bob got on the phone with my mom and called for a 5:30 a.m. meeting with my parents and me the next day. It was as much fun as going to the dentist. Michael is not on the team until he does the set I told him to do yesterday, Bob said. Michael, I don't care if you like it, and I really don't care if you like me, but if you want to be on this team, you have to get in the pool and finish what you were supposed to do yesterday. So this is when Michael was a little bit younger, and Michael really responds well to this type of pushback. Although he didn't like it, although he probably didn't like him, Michael really got the message from understanding the standards that Bob is setting for his swim team. You could see that this might completely spoil swimming for some other kids, but for Michael, swimming is the thing that he loved doing the most. So taking swimming away from him was the greatest punishment, the greatest way for him to understand and get the message about change in behavior. Here's another example of something similar. If you made each practice, you got to wear a yellow cap that said in blue letters, 100% never settle for less. When Bob was training Michael in a new kick early on, he wasn't really getting it. And Michael says, on purpose, I would lapse into the basic kick. What I knew and what I also knew had worked for me until then. Other times, I'd just be lazy and do 2 beats. Either way, Bob would kick me out of practice, yellow cap and all. When I'd call my mom, she would tell me no, she could not leave work early to come get me. I would have to wait until practice was supposed to be over. That's when she would come and get me. This went on until I started doing what I was supposed to do. The first day I went through an entire day of using a 6-beat kick is the day that Bob out and out dared me. He told me I wasn't old enough or mature enough to do it. I did it. So Bob knows that challenging is one of the best ways to keep Michael accountable. Again, this probably won't work for all athletes, but it can work for some. And there's different ways to get the most out of these different athletes in terms of standard and holding to levels of accountability. I think something that is a skill for coaches is knowing when to compromise and when not to. And I really like this example from Bob here. So Michael says, I thought, wait a second, he isn't going to make me practice today. We're already at the pool and I didn't even bring my suit. Hey, it worked on lacrosse, no cup, no goalie. Why wouldn't it work at the pool? Because Bob was my coach now, I thought I was resting today. You're training, Bob said, but I don't have a suit. What can I do? You can get in the car with me. You're kidding. He wasn't kidding. It took us 40 minutes to go back and get the suit. I had a pouty face and a serious attitude all day, but it didn't change the fact that we got the suit and I went back in the water. I really like this. In the world of Michael Phelps, in the world of sports, there are reasonable excuses and there are unreasonable excuses. And according to Bob's standards for his athletes, this wasn't one. And if Michael doesn't like the standards, he can leave. He can not participate. But Michael also knows that these standards are in his best interest. He knows practicing every day, even when he doesn't want to, even when he forgets his swimsuit, is in his best interest. There's other ways to hold someone accountable as well. Michael says, I'm spending 80% of my time at the pool. I told him. Bob rebuffed that with a notebook and a pen and some simple math. So it was only 20%. It sure felt like 80%. I mean, nothing ruins a good argument like a bunch of facts. So I like this idea. It's a little bit lighter, but the idea is that a lot of what we feel and what we think is not necessarily backed up in reality. And coaches can provide a reality check for athletes as well. So it's not just team standards that Bob is working on. He also helps Michael with his personal standards. After a race, I sat by the side of the pool and Bob talked quietly in my ear for 10 minutes so that nobody else could hear. You need to think about which Michael Phelps they'll see in the press conference, he told me. Are you going to pout or be a champion? I was looking off into space because I really didn't want to talk or listen to anyone at that point. I understood what he said, and I knew what my mom had told me about being gracious in defeat. So this is after he lost to Ian Thorpe. Bob said, better here than next summer. Remember, you get another chance at it. Honestly, at that point, I was still seething inside, but the thought of the other chance would drive me to push incessantly over the next 12 months. So again, this isn't just swim standards. This is personal standards that a coach can hold these athletes to. And those things do blend together. The idea that how you think impacts how you perform, or how you frame a situation of this immediate loss versus the loss in the long run, is also an important thing. Another way that coaches can apply accountability is giving athletes ownership over outcomes. Bob made almost all the training decisions, but when it came to the butterfly, he'd occasionally throw me a little rope and give me the choice of doing extra butterfly sets at the ends of practice. I usually declined because I was tired. Hey, it was my best stroke, and I already did a full day's work. I thought I was the coach, and I knew what I was talking about. I had no clue. He let me learn the hard way. It's always the best way to learn. I hadn't improved my time since the race in Fukuoka, and it would take me a while to swim that fast again. At those 2022 Fort Lauderdale Nationals, I had such a great meet except for the 200 fly, at least by the standards that mattered, mine and Bob's. I set out to break the record. I did not get there, and after the race, I put my head in my hands. At that moment, I was only beginning to understand what not training diligently in the butterfly would yield. Later that summer at Panpax in Yokohama, Malchow beat me in the 200 fly. If I needed even more of a blunt reminder, now I had it. I hated losing. I also hated hearing Bob say, "I told you so." After that, Bob gave me punishing butterfly sets. Through Athens, I devoured them. That's what Bob wanted, my best effort. There's a huge difference in not swimming well because of a technical glitch and not swimming well for lack of effort. Bob knows what's what he wants and expects are as many consecutive days of first-rate training as possible. So Bob is giving Michael some ownership. Michael is realizing that it's in his hands why he's losing these races. And I think that that's important for coaches to do. Coaches shouldn't just give the script every time and athletes expect to follow it. Athletes should have some autonomy. And Bob does give Michael some autonomy as well. So this is him talking about how Michael didn't want to do lung busters anymore, and he'd earned that right to not do this type of set.
Basically, it's pulling. They have a band on, they have paddles on, a buoy, and they're breathing 3, 5, 7, 9 by quarters. And I'll tell you how much Michael loves this. After the Athens Olympic Games, he comes to me and he said, "Okay, I had a good Olympics, right?" I'm like, "Yeah, pretty good. You know, could have done better, but pretty good." He says, "I want to negotiate one thing." And I was like, "What?" He's like, "I never want to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lung buster by quarters again." So that came off. He never did it again after the Athens Olympics. Because I love doing that.
The second to last way that a coach can apply accountability, and obviously there's more than just what I'm describing, but these are the examples that I'm seeing, are by checking intentions. Bob said, if you're making a comeback for your sponsors, or if you're doing it because you don't have anything better to do in your life, or if you can't figure your life out, then you shouldn't do it. Michael, I mean it. You shouldn't do it. So this is when Michael is thinking about coming back for the 2016 Rio Olympics. Michael says, "Bob, I can tell you those aren't the reasons." I came at him again. "Let me be clear, Michael, unless you're doing it for the right reasons, and those reasons have to be that you're doing it only for yourself, then you should not do this." Michael said, "That's the only reason I want to do it. For me, I love to swim. I want to swim." This is Bob again. But that was okay, because it meant for me that I was once again in the business of working with someone who knew how to dream big and also knew what it took to make such a dream real. Michael wasn't coming back to win medals. He was coming back to achieve something. And as we had so many times before, we would do it together. One stroke, one kick, one race at a time. A partnership in pursuit of excellence. Coaches are usually focused on the what. You should do X, Y, Z. They're not as often focused on the why. I think understanding the why of your athletes, why they want to excel, why they want to change, is one of the most important things you can do. But that is also, in my mind, a part of accountability. You're holding them accountable to their own aspirations, their own logic, their own decisions. And the last thing that a coach can do in terms of accountability is reminding the athletes and themselves that every meet is important. This is Bob talking about that.
Coach every meet like it's your big meet. Don't let them get away with not trying hard in the local meets. Michael would swim 155 in the 200 fly at our June meet at MBAC, year in, year out. Because he knew that was an opportunity to practice his routine, to practice his racing skills, and to practice everything that goes into a performance. So don't minimize some of these early meets like, oh, well, we're just going to swim for, I don't know why we're swimming, right? You know what I mean? Every meet is important, and the warm-up is important. The way that you go about it, the feedback you get after the races, all of that is just the same at a local meet as it really is at the Olympics.
When we're thinking about accountability, there's also things that coaches can be accountable for that can really help the athletes. This is handling operations, but also creating a plan for the athlete. Michael would set a performance target. I would design a program to help him reach the target, and we would work on a daily basis to get there. So creating a plan, creating a game plan, like we talked about in the previous episode, can be the role of both the coach and the athlete. They can both work on it, but the coach can be the one, or I think probably should be the one that helps to iterate it on a day-to-day basis. If an athlete is always thinking about how they should be adjusting the plan, they probably lose sight of the specific things they should be working on a day-to-day basis. So let's look at how Bob is making adjustments to the game plan for his athletes or for Michael. The trick at altitude is to ride the fine line between doing enough but not too much. Thus, the coaching dilemma: how much to challenge each of us without anyone breaking down. The working theory for Bob and John that we would do just as much work as if we were still in Michigan, but instead of 2 swims per day, it would be spread over 3. The shorter sessions being less of a challenge to the immune system. Even so, Bob would spend most of his time in Colorado worried about us going over the edge, because once you're over, it's over. You don't come back, at least not quickly. So Bob is at altitude in Colorado Springs trying to balance this fine line. He is taking these preemptive measures to be able to mitigate this. He does this in other ways too. So Michael says, we had never done a wake up and swim before. Some coaches swear by them, not Bob. We'd never had a morning final before though. And Bob didn't want to spend the next 30 years wondering if he should have had me do a wake up and swim. So I did 500 and 800 meters, just enough to get moving. Another interesting one is preparing for the Olympics. So Bob has a lot of knowledge from going and doing and coaching at a lot of Olympics. And this is how his specific knowledge can help Michael and other coaches because the pools at the Olympics close at noon.
You need to learn to go a single the morning before the Olympics start, because all the pools close at noon. I like to go in the morning anyway, because then they shave after and then they're ready to go. But it's just one of these little things that it was already kind of what we were doing. But if get them used to, they have to swim twice every day, and they have to swim twice all the way until they swim, and they swim the first day of the Olympics, they're out of luck because there are no pools the afternoon.
Bob is responsible for doing what are known as dry runs as well. So it's great to do a dry run for the crowded schedule I might be looking at in Athens. And each day Bob had everything figured out to the minute. When I would warm up, warm down, take my laps, get my lactate tests, have a snack between races. His paranoia and my swimming would really be put to the first big test. This reminds me of when Tiger Woods would do practice rounds before majors. They're following Michael's every move. Later, Bob conducted some mock interviews with me, going over the talking points and making me say answers back to him. There's a reason, he told me, why people can think twice as fast as they can speak. Back home, the Baltimore Sun began running a Phelps fever meter with an arrow that ran from normal to delirious. And to think this was still pretty close to normal. Is it up to the athlete to prepare in this way, to prepare for the interviews, to prepare for everything that they would see? Probably not. I think a coach or maybe an administrator, an operations person can help an athlete work through all of these things. This is unbelievably important, especially if you're going to an Olympics or an event where you're out of your element. Trying to make it as routine as possible, like we talked about in episode 2, is really important. Another thing that a coach can do in terms of operations is just keep the athlete on track. I was talking to one of my friends, and he works with a golfer, and basically the golfer is late to or threatens being late to his tee times a lot of the time. And his job is to just go out there and move him along, because you get penalized if you're late. But should it necessarily be the athlete's responsibility to be on top of that? Yes, a little bit. But also, if they're really in the zone practicing, it could be better for someone else to handle that. Before the morning swim, I followed the routine Bob had meticulously planned for me. I ate a light oatmeal breakfast, stretched for half an hour exactly 2 hours before the race, did 35 minutes of drills and light swimming, relaxed up to half an hour before the event, put on a racing suit, took a light swim 10 minutes before, and then got on the blocks to race. Bob has an internal stopwatch of a mad scientist. If daily plans are off by minutes or split times are off by hundredths of seconds, the vein starts popping and his lungs start shouting. He doesn't want anything to be random. Bob caught up to me and then handed me my instant breakfast drink. As much energy as I expended, I need to keep weight on to keep nutrients in my body after the races and long training days. So proud of you, he said. Felt great, I told him. At that point, Bob was trying to get me back into the practice pool as fast as possible so I could swim down and get some of the lactic acid out of my legs, especially with 3 more races that day. A warm down at the end of the race was as important as a warm up before one. Now, this is Bob talking about the role of an Olympic coach.
But coaching at the Olympics is it's about helping them, number one, focus on the task at hand and not have all these distractions. And number two, helping them handle them when they come up, because something's going to come up, right? I tell every one of my kids at the Olympics, the Olympics is just a large media event with some athletic contests sprinkled in.
I agree.
So realize that's what it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you're going to kind of work through your routine, your mental preparation, and you're going to rehearse that all the way along the way. Michael does the same thing behind the blocks in his last race in Rio that he did the first race I ever saw him swim.
Something that coaches can also do, might not be the most fun, is monitoring and feedback. It's especially important for us to monitor my lactate levels in between races, something Bob and I had been doing since before my first Olympics. Think of lactate as a sort of fatigue level that your body builds up when it expends a lot of energy. If you swim a fast race and ask a lot of your muscles in a short period of time, the lactate will accumulate in your legs, make it difficult to come back right away and swim fast again. A lactate test measures the amount of lactate in the blood, which indicates how quickly you go into oxygen debt. Coaches use it to determine how efficiently swimmers produce energy. Essentially, someone pricks your ear after each race and places a few drops of blood into a machine, which measures the number of millimoles of blood lactate per liter of blood. The level can rise to 10 to 12 after a hard race, but we try to get it to clear or reduce to a manageable level below 2, so that I can swim again without too much fatigue in my body. We try to get the rate down to 1.1 or less by having me swim down slowly after a race. The tests all tell me how much I need to swim down afterwards, which is usually about 23 minutes. Bob Bowman, mad scientist or raging genius, you decide. So Bob is monitoring these things. Obviously, Michael is thinking about them too, but Bob usually will look at the test and tell Michael what the swim down needs to be. Michael doesn't necessarily always need to be thinking about these things if Bob is there and can be monitoring and giving this feedback. Michael is talking about in this next clip how the coach allows the athlete to simplify by taking care of the complex stuff.
I need sleep, I need to eat, I need to drink water, I need to study, like whatever it is, right? Like process those 5 things that you need to do and focus on those, right? Like I always feel like when you start doing too many things, you start losing your mind, right? Instead of just simplifying it and take on 5 things, do 5 things well for 30 days, you create that habit. And then in another 30 days, you can do 5 other things.
So thinking operationally is generally focused on what's happening right now, how you can keep the athlete on track. I think a coach's role is also focused on thinking long-term. Even at a time like this, Bob always thought about tomorrow and the next challenge. He never let me look back during the entire Olympics. So not just in the individual races, but Bob is thinking about the next training cycle, the next event, all of these things during the current race. He has the liberty to do that. The athlete does not. Part of thinking long-term is avoiding threats. Jamie started talking about it really casually at practice the next day, and Bob just flipped. You did what? Bob, we just went bowling. It's not like we played football. Jamie, have you ever heard of Matt Gribble? No. He had a 100-fly world record back in the 80s. He messed his back up bowling one night, and it took him right out of nationals the next day because of it. So Bob is maybe irrationally thinking about threat protection, but if you're working with a high-level athlete, someone whose livelihood depends on the finest of details, maybe there are some things that you shouldn't be focused on. Bob's also accounting for bumps in the road. So nothing is wrong at all. In fact, it's good. But it's a matter of time before things start to change for Michael, and nothing's going to be the same. This is him talking to Michael's mom. What do you mean? He's way ahead of schedule right now, and at some point, I don't know when, we're going to really need to get ready for media attention, hype, and expectations. So when Michael's a kid, before any of this is happening, better for them to be prepared, better for Michael to start preparing for media attention than to have it just spring up on him. Thinking ahead also involves competition and thinking about other athletes. Obviously, the goal of Michael's is to break time records, but other athletes can also break time records. And learning from them, understanding what they do, seeing where they're tracking is relevant for Michael as well. Lotke and I don't do a lot of head-to-head sets because, as Bob figures, someone's likely to learn something about the other guy. One morning, however, we lined up for a complicated set, 4 of each stroke that ended with fast 50s of each stroke. Fast meaning race pace. On the fly, Lotke was close to me. On the back, dead even, In the breast, he was perhaps a full second ahead, a huge difference. We were dead even again on the free. I was happy with the set. Bob was happy too, but you could almost see him thinking, I knew he had noticed how fast Lotke had been during the breast. If I never once imagined Ryan beating me, Bob probably thought about it every day. Maybe that's just the way we have to go. So Bob is thinking about his competition, thinking about where he can improve. Although he doesn't want Michael to race against Ryan Lotke in practice a lot, or Ryan Lotke, I think it's Lachey. Ryan Lotke in practice a lot, Bob can see the differences in their pacing, and he sees a huge gap available for Michael Phelps. Early on, Bob is also responsible for helping Michael build really useful tools and skills that help him over the course of his career. Michael says, Mom and I used to go through relaxation and programming techniques at home. My coach, Bob Bowman, had my mom buy a book that set out drills and exercises, including one in which I would tighten my right hand into a fist and relax it, and then do the same with my left hand, as a way of learning to deal with tension. At night, before falling asleep, I would lie on my bed. She'd read to me from that book, and I would practice. I know I touched about it a little bit before, but here's another example of a dry run. This is also forward planning. I won the 200 back and then the 100 free, rallying from next to last at the 50-meter turn and beating Neathling at the wall. Then I swam 200 free by myself as an exhibition and a sort of stress test to see how I do with 3 swims in a short period of time. In this case, about 40 minutes. In between races, my lactate level was at 14, which is much higher than we would ever want to see it. Right before the 200 free, it was still at 7.9, nowhere close to the 2.0 we shoot for. Still, my 200 free time was 1:48.30, much faster than the time I swam when Neatling beat me a few days earlier. More important, it gave me an idea of how I could do swimming 3 races in just such a short period of time, the way I'd have to at the trials in Long Beach a few months away. So they're prepping his body, seeing what he's capable of way out. He had to do a ton of this for the 2008 Olympics because he was swimming so many races. I think people don't realize that Michael winning 8 gold medals, it's not necessarily just impressive that he won the medals, what he did in the pool. The idea is that he had to swim so many races to win those 8 gold medals. That's what makes it an unbelievable feat. And he was able to swim all those races because he prepped like this and he tested what his body was capable of. Bob was largely responsible for that testing. Now, the last part of thinking long-term is tracking data and looking at feedback loops. This is Bob talking about the medical testing and the regular blood work that he's doing with his athletes.
As we progressed through USA Swimming, we were able to do regular blood work so that we were getting a CBC and training markers, CK, cortisol, those sort of things. And we actually did adjust training according to those. We have a database now, particularly on Michael and some of our other people, where we, I think that's very valuable. If you can have that blood chemistry, super valuable.
So we talked about long-term thinking, but another thing semi-related to that coaches can do is research, thinking of the bigger picture of how athletes can improve or how the sport is evolving more generally. Something we've talked about a lot in past episodes is a lot of athletes love to study the people that come before them. Coaches should absolutely be doing that as well, whether it's them studying other coaches or studying historic athletes that their current athletes could model their play after. Michael says, now he could read almost anything and everything written about me and us and about swimming in general. I don't bother reading much, if any of it. It can seem overwhelming. Bob is not overwhelmed. He loves fishing for stories, and he not only reads, but remembers what was said. This is an example of that. The Americans were going to smash them. That's what we came here for. I'll start my games in the 4x100 meters freestyle relay final, confident that my pals will have us qualified easily. So I believe this was the French talking about how they would win the 4x100 freestyle relay. Bob, the internet sleuth, had found the French comments. He said, hey, guess what I read? Then proceeded to describe what he'd found. Bob added, and here came the loaded code phrase that he knew would carry an extra zing. It says here that they think they're pretty much going to smash you like guitars. Comments like that make me more fired up, I said. That's nice. This is going to be fun. So it probably doesn't behoove the individual athletes to be reading all news and media coverage of them. It's actually probably a bad thing, especially if they're hearing about what the pundits and the people outside looking in are saying. The coach can benefit from that. They can find what's useful in that information and filter it for the individual athletes. Again, I still think athletes should read. I think they should study who came before them pretty diligently. But having a coach to filter that information and find exactly what's useful to you can be a huge benefit to both parties. Bob also had an interest, and coaches in general should have an interest in studying how training is approached by different athletes and different coaches over time. This is Bob's take on how cross-training has benefited Michael or could benefit Michael and his athletes over time. He also talks about why he does a 1,500 once a year.
Well, I just think the energy systems are very similar, right? And the way that they're put together is very similar. And I think in our country, we get kind of caught up in the short course swimming. And we forget that a 200-yard free, for instance, is the same thing as 100 meters. 500 free is 200 meters. We don't like to think that, but that's the way it is. So it's very similar in the long course. If you want to train a really good 200, I feel like you have to have at least a strong 400 in your bag somewhere. That club has to be in your bag. Doesn't have to be everything you do. But, Michael, for instance, don't want to use his name too much, but like we had a deal with him in the extreme when he was swimming this big program. The deal was he had to swim 1,500 meters once a year. And he did that all the way through 2008. He did his best time, the last one he swam in 2008. So it's kind of that theory, which, I know it's a little old school, but it really works. And long course, it really works.
It can also be a benefit for coaches to study other athletes to figure out what they can bring in. I alluded to that earlier. Michael says, I used to watch videos of Ian Thorpe's races and marvel at how smoothly he swam the freestyle. Ian had the best underwater dolphin kick on the planet, and I wanted to incorporate that into my training. I've always been a decent kicker, but Bob really stressed that I should maximize my strengths, and so we made the dolphin kick a priority that summer. What it doesn't say here is that Bob was constantly studying Ian Thorpe. He was modeling not just Michael's swimming strokes and his freestyle after Ian Thorpe, but also how he handled himself in the media. A coach's role is also to study other coaches and be the best version of themselves. Bob's mentor, Paul Bergen, believed in the benefits of training at altitude. That led Bob to the altitude training protocols developed by Gennady Turetsky, the former Soviet national sprint coach who, from a base in Australia, directed Alexander Popov, the Russian swimmer who won the sprints, both the 50 and the 100, at both the 1992 and 1996 Atlanta Olympics. Bob managed to get copies of what Turetsky had done, using that as a starting point, then mixing in John's proven success in designing programs to hone the middle distance swimmers. Bob designed his own plan that pushed each one of us to our limits. This is Bob talking about how he worked with a lot of Olympic coaches and what he learned from them.
Well, I was actually lucky. I worked with a lot of really good coaches, and I picked that up along the way. I was with 3 different Olympic coaches I work with, and every one of them kind of gave me a little something. And, when I was coaching with Paul Bergen, I learned how to do the training and the racing his way. When I was with David Marsh, I learned how to do it his way. When I was with Murray Stevens, I learned how to do it his way. And I took all of those things and kind of took the best from each and kind of made it my way. But I think the mindset that those guys had to get people to the top levels of performance is probably where I picked all of that stuff up. It's like the way that you do anything is how you're going to do everything.
This is another take, sort of identifying what to work on, strengths and weaknesses, where Bob is talking about how Michael and him honed the underwater kick.
Because he was very good at underwater kicking, and we started doing it quite a bit in practice. And when Michael first broke the world record in the 400 IM, 2002, at the Nationals, August, just before this period of training, he had a historic event. It was like in Fort Lauderdale in this very shallow pool, And he and Eric Vent raced the 400 IM. Michael went very fast and flying back. He was far ahead, right? Eric caught him immediately in breaststroke and kind of pulled even. So by the time they got into freestyle, it was almost even. Michael was a little bit ahead. But then Michael, on the last turn of freestyle, kicked to 15 meters underwater and opened up enough of a gap that he could win the race, even though Eric ran him down into swimming. So that was why we started with it. I remember when he got home earlier this fall, right after that meet, he started underwater kicking all the time. I mean, all the time.
The next thing a coach can offer to an athlete, we touched a lot on in episode 2, which is creating adversity and also building a philosophy for the athlete, a mindset for approaching challenges. So one way they can do this is by continually testing athletes' limits and helping to build this resilient mindset. This is Michael. A few months after Bob had been coaching me, he issued orders for a pretty difficult practice, especially for someone my age. When it was over, all the other kids were dragging. They got out of the pool slowly. I got out, but I still had a ton of energy. So much so that I kept running to the side of the pool, filling up my cap with water and dumping water on the other kids' heads. Bob ran over to tell me to knock it off. He told me that if I was still frisky, he could for sure make practices a lot harder. I said, and Bob has never forgotten this, I will never get tired. We have since dispelled that rumor. You have to be mentally tough to go through it with Bob. If you're not mentally tough, you're not learning what he's teaching you. Growing up, I used to tell Bob when he would order a set that would make my eyes widen, I can't do that. He would say, there's a difference between can't and won't. If you say can't, you're restricting what you can do or what you'll ever do. You can use your imagination to do whatever you want. Can't, he would say, that's a tough word. Early on, Bob put me through a butterfly workout that went on for 3,000 meters. That was nearly 2 miles of only butterfly. When things started getting much more serious in my mid-teens, I was worked through a freestyle set that went on for 12,000 meters. That's about 7 miles. It went like this: 1-800, 2-700s, 3-600s, 4-500s, 5-400s, 6-300s, 7-200s, 8-100s. I would do a set built on this combination: 300 free, 200 fly. Each 500 amounted to 1. I did 10. The worst sets ever would involve long repetitions, say 3100s, bad enough, but with a twist. At the 50-meter mark, you'd have to climb out of the pool, then start the remaining 50 from the blocks. One of my favorite sets, Bob likes to say, because getting out of the pool and diving back in adds an extra component to the thing that's just brutal. After 20, you're grabbing a block, you can't see straight. Things are blurry. You feel like you can't move, but you can. That's what I came to understand. At that point, it's pretty much just goals. If you want to meet your goals, this is what it takes. I really like this idea of eliminating can't from your vocabulary. The idea is that a lot of things in sports are achievable. Most of us are just not willing to put in the work, or we don't have the know-how to get there. So if we're eliminating can't, we're opening the possibilities of how we can achieve something. It's either by putting in more work or approaching it in a fundamentally different way. There's a book that I really liked. It's called 10x is easier than 2x. And the overarching concept is that you should be setting goals that are 10x your capability. Essentially, you want to accomplish things that are very difficult or that you give yourself very low probabilities to do that. And the reason you set these super ambitious goals is because just by doing more work, it's almost impossible to reach them. So if you're just increasing your output, you're not really able to reach them. What you have to do is approach it a fundamentally different way. And there's probably only a few ways to approach it differently to get to where you want to go to. So by setting these incredibly ambitious goals, you're eliminating the number of possible things that could work, and you're focusing only on the ones that have the highest leverage to actually get there. I'll link that book in the description. Again, a little bit outside of the scope of this podcast. This is Michael talking about why he doesn't say can't after Bob's coaching.
Right? Like, he took that out of my vocabulary at such a young age, because if you say you can't do something, turn the page, move on. Like, why are you wasting your time? You've made that choice up for yourself. So we completely removed it from our vocabulary because we wanted to have a chance, right? Like, that's all I'm doing. Like, I wanted to have a chance to be the greatest.
Another aspect of dealing with adversity is getting the athletes comfortable with discomfort. Bob also, quite deliberately, would arrange practices, schedules, workouts, drills, whatever he could think of around the idea of being uncomfortable. His thinking has always been to put his swimmers through every scenario possible. You're tired, you feel like you can't move, you're truly hurting. That's when he would throw down especially hard sets. Bob wanted to gauge not only how I felt under pressure, but more important, how I responded under pressure. If I could deal with whatever it was when I was tired, I could deal with anything that came my way. Because this is the real definition of a champion. Someone who can deal with any obstacle that comes his or her way. Can deal with any situation at any given point. A champion can deal with any kind of pressure. It isn't just the intensity of practices, however, that made up the Bowman approach to stress management. It was anything and everything. It's why, going all the way back in 99 in the Nationals in Minneapolis, he dragged me back all the way to the hotel to get a swimsuit. So this was a feature of Bob's practices. He would intentionally make them as difficult as possible. He would throw curveballs, and he would build this in as much as possible. Here's another example. He knows that I shiver if I stay in cold water too long, and it was a cold, gray day in the pool warmed only by the solar heat. Would I tough it out? Yes. In Australia in 2003, Bob deliberately asked our driver to show up late. That way, I had to spend more time waiting at the pool, and we missed dinner. I ordered pizza. That same trip, he stepped on my goggles on purpose. I had to make do. A power outage one day at the pool in Michigan meant nothing. We swam in the dark. That was good, Bob said. Made you swim by feel. Forced you to count your strokes. Back in Australia in 2007, at the Worlds in Melbourne, my goggles started sliding down my face as I turned into the final 50, the freestyle leg of the 200 IM. The goggles filled with water. I couldn't see Latke or Che at all. I knew that I had turned around half a second ahead, and so I just dove for home. When I touched and turned, I blinked and blinked until I could see the board. 154.98, a new world record. So what if I couldn't see? What's important now? Getting it done no matter what. And then this extends, as we talked about in episode 2, to his Olympics in Beijing. He says, I could not see the line on the bottom of the pool. I could not see the black tee that marks coming to the wall. I could not see anybody else in any other lane. I could not see. This wasn't football or basketball. I didn't have the luxury of calling a timeout. I couldn't take the goggles off and swim old school because the goggles were trapped under both caps. This was an Olympic final. I had to go. At that instant, that's what was the most important thing. I had to go hard and fast. There was no time to think about anything. But what was there to think about? I was the furthest thing from freaked out. This very thing happened to me just a year before in Melbourne in the 200 IM finals. It happened sometimes in swimming. It was happening to me now. In the 200 fly, there's a regular and predictable progression of strokes as the race goes along. That is, there are so many strokes per length of pool, the number typically going up by 1 per lap because of the inevitable demands on the body and fatigue. So he is fundamentally prepared by all of these things that he has been working on. Same thing, a lot of parallels with Tiger's dad, where Earl Woods is jingling chains in his pocket, calling him names, doing all these things. I think what's important to notice about creating adversity and doing these things, one, the athlete has to be ready and there have to be bounds to it. So Tiger had asked Earl to prepare him mentally for these things. Part of the programming that Michael is doing, he understands it's to build resilience for him, and he is buying into it. If there isn't buy-in and a coach or a parent is just doing some of these activities, it is inherently abuse and it should not be done. But creating that relationship where the athletes understand the value of it is really important. And the things that Earl did, calling Tiger names, making noises, whatever these things, they're things that he faced in his competitions on the golf course. Same thing with Michael. His goggles broke. He, was forgetting things. He was showing up late, and he was now able to prepare because he'd been adequately prepared before. The other side of this, so the next thing that I want to talk about associated with the coach's role is kind of the opposite. So pushing the athlete and challenging the athlete and creating adversity is important for the coaches to do, but they should also do the opposite of that, which is advocating and protecting the athletes as well. When Michael is swimming in one of the relays, Bob is going and talking to the coach to say where he thinks Michael should swim. Bob asked that I swim leadoff. That's where I would feel most comfortable. 2 reasons. I like being able to get an early lead, and I thought I could. Also, for the guy going second, third, or fourth, the timing of leaving the blocks is an intricate thing. The ultimate goal is to time the dive so that you're horizontal to the water surface, but your feet are still in contact with the blocks, as the swimmer in the water is making his touch. So maybe Michael isn't as comfortable with the timing. Maybe he feels like he could perform best in the first leg. Sometimes it isn't up to Michael to advocate for himself there. Your coach can come in and advocate for you. Same thing goes for playing time or for how you should be used in a team sport or something along those lines. Sometimes it doesn't look good coming from you. If we're working, let's say in a team event, and a player comes and advocates for themselves, it might be very different than if their coach is advocating for them. So I think that that's a nice service a coach can provide, is being able to have a conversation because they're expected to advocate for you. So this is in an interview Michael was doing. The interview asks, "Do you have a girlfriend?" Michael says, "I had no idea what to do or say or how to answer that. My face got pretty red as I told them I did. Then they asked her name, which I gave them. I also told them the fact that she was attending Delaney High, a rival school. They practically asked me her social security number. Then someone asked, 'Did you kiss her?' Bob was sitting next to me, watching me squirm with every question. He covered the microphone with his hands and quietly said, 'No comment.' To let me know I didn't have to answer everything. I told them no comment." So maybe Bob should have stepped in a little bit earlier there, but that is a role that he can also help with. Michael doesn't have to answer all these questions. He can be buffered by some of these things. And you also see this in Federer. So Federer created a whole team around buffering him from sponsorship negotiations, from logistics, from all these other things. They were taken care of by his team or by his coaches. The person who played that role for the longest time for Federer was either Mirka, his wife, or Severin Luthi, who was the overarching administrator of his coaching staff. Here's another example. "We need your swimmer in 5 minutes," they told him. "The schedule says that it's not for 20 minutes, Bob said. "Yes, but they must wait. Sorry, you'll get him in 15. So he is buying Michael time to get his appropriate rest and warm down in. Another example is here. So Bob told the crew that they could start filming at 9, but they actually arrived at 7 to start setting up. When he passed by their camera, he discovered that the camera was on and filming while the crew was waiting in the front hallway. Bob went up to the people and told them simply, 'You're out of here. No interview, no more filming.' A woman on the crew broke down in tears, but they still had to leave." Bob is very protective of Michael. He's protective of his athletes. And if something could be a distraction, if something could be a hindrance, it's his role to step in and prevent that from happening. In this circumstance, he can also be a sounding board. So all along, we had to ask, was the media exposure adversely affecting my training? Peter ran everything through Bob, who Peter was his agent, who had veto power over everything. And this veto power and this filtering mechanism that a coach or a team can have, I also think is very important. So with every photo shoot, interview request, press conference, and TV appearance, Bob would ask Peter, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much would this benefit Michael? There is such a huge parallel with Roger Federer here. So Roger, when he became world number 1, he essentially, and for most of his career, only took sponsors that he felt super aligned with, that didn't intersect and detract from his practice and his play. And a coach can be someone that helps to decide that, helps to determine if something is a good time investment, worth the cost of time that you have to spend with a sponsor for the money that you're getting in return. Well, this next one is one of my favorite ways that a coach can help. So I talked in the last episode how motivation isn't always necessary to take action. A lot of the times we get action from motivation. On the other hand, motivation and having someone in your corner that helps to motivate you can be unbelievably helpful. Studying Michael Phelps in particular, and pretty much in almost all these other athletes, they use so many different levers and so many different things to motivate them on a day-to-day basis. They are unbelievably motivated because they constantly are reminding themselves of what is important. And Bob, as a coach, and many other coaches do this in a very effective way. And this is something I think any coach can really help a lot of athletes with. He is a master tactician. He can break a swim stroke down so that any swimmer, young or old, novice or Olympic level, can understand the method behind the madness. But calling Bob a swimming tactician undervalues his true calling. He is a motivator and a teacher. He's someone who can take people with passion and show them how far they can go with it. He's developed a formula for helping people go from one level to the next. And through his method, they learn more about who they actually are. In short, he makes people better. And a lot of the time, maybe the motivator and the instructor don't have to be the same person, but having someone that helps to motivate you can be a huge asset. So a way that Bob does this a lot of the time, and how coaches can do this a lot of the time, is by sending little reminders. And I've started to implement this in my own life, having little reminders everywhere, whether it's on my mirror, on the fridge, on a whiteboard in my office, phone reminders in my notebook, all these things of the things that are important to me. Every now and then I would ask Michael, what's my job? And he would say, to get me in the ballpark. Then I would ask, Michael, what's your job? To get my hands on the ball. On this morning, we didn't bother with any of the playful exchanges. Our work was done, and Michael knew it. In fact, come performance time, my job required a little more than providing him with company. The idea that Michael has to be reminded that all his job is to touch the ball, right? Is to finish the race, is to hit the times that they want. You'd think, oh, he should know that. It should be on his mind all the time. No, he constantly has to be reminded even of the simplest things. Bob says, I'll review the plan, though I rarely change a thing. Still, I'm not done. I'm always scribbling a motivational quote at the bottom of the sheet to give the swimmers an extra kick. This is the workout plan. This is the day's formula for adding fuel to the swimmers' Rio aspirations. So every single swimmer he's writing a motivational quote for. It could be the same motivational quote, but he is constantly giving them a little more fuel, a little more fuel. I think that there's like a good metaphor for the gas tank, right? If you have, this is kind of corny, but if you only run on gasoline and you're in the middle of the desert and you're kind of stuck, if you run out of gasoline, you're screwed. If you have a car that is a hybrid that can take gas and also uses battery energy, you can probably drive a little bit further. If you have a car, I don't think that these really exist, that use gas, that use solar, that use all these different energy sources, you're really never going to run out of energy a lot of the time. And Bob is able to provide a lot of these different energy motivation sources for Michael and for any of his athletes. He wrote the program out longhand, then made copies for each of us and for the coaches. It was way too complicated to memorize. The trick was to dip your own copy in the pool water, which would give it just enough stick to get it stuck on the metal guardrail at the end of each of our lanes. Each workout also included a notation in the corner: how many days to go until the trials in Omaha, as well as the games in Beijing. There were kicking drills, work with kickboards, snorkels and paddles, with fins, parachutes. There were no bathroom breaks, at least for the guys. If you had to go, you went right there in the pool. There's another mechanism, not just positive reinforcement. The idea that there is a countdown for when you have to do something can also be a powerful forcing function. Again, we touched a little bit on this in episode 2, but novelty, keeping things new, switching things up is another really great motivating force. I think people forget that fun is also motivation. Because of Bob's travel schedule and his obligations to both the college and club swimmers, he couldn't always be with me for each meet and training session. Still, he'd always find clever ways to keep me motivated, even when he wasn't there to watch. One day, he left behind some notes for a workout he called the Tour de Firme, short for Freestyle IM, a takeoff on the Tour de France bike race. We assumed this would be a pretty dull session, but it became pretty spirited because of the way he structured it. To begin with, a firm is a freestyle individual medley in which we swim IMs, but replace the butterfly strokes with a traditional freestyle stroke. Bob broke the day into 6 stages, the way they do in France. Eric won the first 1600 meter stage, and we started to get competitive. To keep it fresh, he also had to find ways to change it up. He knew that would not only provide variety, it would keep me focused. So for instance, I would be asked to swim with my arms only, or my legs only, or with one arm or with one leg. I would even do butterfly and backstroke legs using only my right or left arm. That would isolate the one arm and make me concentrate on the way and move through the water. To improve my freestyle technique, I would do a drill that involved me keeping my elbows high while I pulled through the water with my fingertips. That would make my legs do more of the work. I would swim in sneakers while tethered to a pulley, wearing a scuba vest with the inner tube around my ankles. All these devices work to increase resistance the same way a baseball player takes swings in the warm-up circle with a donut on the bat. When the donut comes off and it's time to get in the batter's box for real, the bat feels a whole lot lighter and easier to swing. The last part of motivation is, again, knowing your athletes and knowing what gets them going. I have reinforced this a bunch of times. I think repetition is one of the best ways to really ingrain a point and a topic. And I'm repeating it because I think that this is really important. Knowing the individual athletes that a coach works with, knowing the tendencies that a coach has as an athlete is one of the most important things for getting the most out of either your athletes or your coaches. And now comes Bob, the morning of the race, to say that the French are trash talking, that they're going to smash us like guitars. Gary's words from 2000 now thrown in our face. When I heard that, it was like a switch flipped in my body. Like, you really want to do that? We didn't need any more motivation, but we had just gotten it. I said to Jason at breakfast, "You hear what the French are saying?" He just smiled. Bob and I saw Garrett on his way back from breakfast. "Hey, guess what the French said?" "I don't want to hear it," Garrett said. "We'll take care of business when we get out to the pool." We got to the pool pretty fired up, and then we got fired up some more. Obviously, this is something that people talking trash about Michael, something that really fired him up. Some people don't want to hear that. Some people don't care. Obviously, in this case, Garrett, his fellow swimmer in that relay, didn't really care for it. But Bob knew that that would really prod Michael. This was another interesting thing. On September 11th, 2001, I reported to an afternoon practice at Meadowbrook. Bob began the session, which ultimately ended early with a defiant prep talk. We don't stop for snow, for rain, for a flood, and we sure aren't going to stop for terrorists, he declared. Terrorists might kill innocent Americans, but not our dreams. They want us to sit at home and be scared. That, he said, is not us. During those years, Bob figured, counting meets, that I could work in the pool for about 550 times each year. In all, between Sydney and Athens, about 2,200 times, enough to swim somewhere around 9,000 miles. So obviously, Michael is very patriotic. He's an Olympic swimmer. This is something that matters a lot to him. I love how Bob framed, the terrible acts in 2001. And he was able to use that to give Michael even more motivation, turning something unbelievably terrible into a force to push against any of the fear and the chaos that evil people are trying to create is a really, really powerful and interesting message. This goes back to when Michael was, I think it was in 2008, one of his good friends who's a Navy SEAL sent him a message and talked about how he was doing this not just for himself, but for his country and for a lot of these things. That's something that really pulls at Michael. And there's going to be different things for different people, but in this case, this is something that worked really well to get him excited about swimming. If we're talking about motivation, I think a really clean example from Bob is how he got Michael to learn the 6-speed kick. This is him talking about that.
We were watching videos of Ian Thorpe and Grant Hackett when Thorpe won the world championship at 15 years old in Australia. We had been watching those videos over and over. It's like, this is what you need to swim like. If you're going to race these guys, you have to swim like this. So we started doing this, and we called it his big kick. So it would go like this. We would be in practice, and I would say, okay, on this set, you're going to use your big kick. And I would make it so he could kind of do it. And he would do his big kick, and it'd be really fast, and he would look great. And then he would kind of go back to the rest of the sets as kind of not that good, 2B. But I figured I was just going to try to sneak it up on him and just add and add and add till virtually he was doing it all the time.
When we talk about motivation, one of the most motivating tools that a coach can help with is setting goals. I've probably beaten the goal setting conversation to death at this point, but I was viewing that from the athlete's perspective. A coach or a mentor, someone along these lines, can also help assess goals, set goals, and make sure that the athletes are being held accountable to the goals. Michael says, Bob was one of a kind. He made me see the value of pursuing excellence and what it could bring. And what was that? No, not medals or records, but memories born of dreams. So this is how Bob framed goals for Michael Phelps.
So I think he taught me the importance of goal setting at such a young age, short term, long term. And for me, I was as detailed as you could possibly imagine, like down to the 100th. So if I want to go 49.98, I got to find how I'm going to, how I'm going to do that. But so I got to take it out in 24 seconds, right? We'll call it that. So how many 24-second 50s do I have to do in practice? So he taught me that at such an early age. And I think that basically opened the door for me to really challenge my mind to believe that anything was possible.
World record, Austin. Bob had been writing that on almost every note he had left me since the Olympic swim in Sydney. I hadn't won a medal there, and that drove me for the next 6 months. I was grabbing for a goal. I needed a goal the way a car needs fuel. I desperately wanted to break a world record, to make a statement that I had arrived, to validate the work that we'd put in. So Bob is the one that's giving Michael this world record goal because he believes Michael is capable of it. Michael, who is pretty young at this point, I think he's around 16 after that first Olympics in 2000, where he didn't get the results that he wanted. And I think at that time, he didn't really know enough to be able to set as accurate and effective goals as he could. As he grew, he started to get a lot better at that. But in this circumstance, Bob could help him out and say, hey, this is a reasonable goal. This is something that is the right level of difficulty. Bob also had some fun incentives that he would provide, but leave it to Bob to give me an unexpected incentive. He agreed that if I could lower my world record from 156.04 to anything under 156, he would shave his head. I mean, never mind the gold medals and $1 million bonuses. This was a serious prize. This would be my 23rd race in 19 days, but maybe my legs weren't as tired as I thought. I got to the final wall and saw that 155.96 on the board. Then I started punching the water and pointed to my head as I stared at Bob on the side of the deck. I became the first male swimmer to win 5 US titles at 1 national championship, but even better, when I got back to Meadowbrook the next day, I could see my reflection in Bob's forehead. I love this idea of fun and creative and novel ways to motivate. That arguably motivated Michael as much as any of the medals, as any of the accolades. And that's a powerful force to be able to have something fun and relatively low stakes to be able to do that. I think that that's incredibly powerful. This is Bob on his take for setting goals in training, the mindset for competition versus practice.
Before you do it in competition, you have to do it in training. So I'll guarantee you that Michael came into practices most of the time, and I actually started this with him. It's probably the one special thing I did with him. From the time that he was 11 until he was probably 15, he was treated just like every other kid in the group, except for this. I used to write my practices in a notebook, and then I would put them up piece by piece on the board as we went along, because I didn't want them to know what was happening, because I thought they would save up or not try harder. Now I just give him the whole thing, and it seems to work out just fine. But he would come down to my office. He was the first one at practice usually, and I can still hear his little flip-flops scuffing down the hallway. And he would come in my office, and I would show him the practice, and I would tell him exactly what I wanted from every part of it. And I would say, do not tell anybody what's on here. And of course, he'd go right out there and tell everybody what was on it.
It's great to help set goals for athletes. It's great to have ambitions and things that you're shooting for, but inevitably things don't always go great. And a coach can also help to give an athlete perspective. Sometimes things aren't as bad as they seem. And when things go bad, it's important to have someone there who can help you evaluate objectively what the worst case is and where to go from there. This is Bob. I'd barely said a word though when Michael launched into me. I know, I didn't train. I played golf. I didn't come to the pool enough. I can't swim. I know. What else can I do wrong? I just said, you know what, Michael? There's a whole list of things that you've done wrong, but we're going to start with the breaststroke. That immediately toned him down. All he said was okay. So this is in, I believe, after the 2012 Olympics when he didn't get the results that he wanted. And instead of admonishing Michael, instead of doing all these things and thinking about all the stuff he could have done wrong, Bob is able to frame this as, hey, what can we do now? What can we focus on? What's important in this moment? And he was really able to change Michael's frame. Sometimes athletes need that. They get so wrapped up in what didn't go well or what they didn't do that they stop focusing on what they could do to get to where they want to go. And I said, I'm not letting you off the hook because you didn't train properly for the Olympics, but we're going to do this, improve your breaststroke, because that's what we can do today. Probably should have read that first, but I think that really highlights what I just described. The last time the world had seen Michael compete in the Olympics in Beijing, he went undefeated. 8 events, 8 gold medals. Now, on day 1 of London, he had already been vanquished. But Michael turned the defeat, if you want to call a 4th place finish a defeat, into a positive. And over the next week, he made the Olympic magic again, winning 4 golds and 2 silvers. So Michael had a really poor outcome, and Bob was able to give him a frame of reference to be able to turn this around. So at that moment in 2012, he didn't prepare enough. He wasn't necessarily ready for the stage, but what could he do in that moment? Bob reminded him that he had more races to swim and that's all he could really focus on. He can't do anything about the past of what wasn't done. I think another way a coach can help is by letting go. So obviously Michael and Bob didn't talk before the races, and he sort of let Michael do his thing. This is Bob talking about why he did that.
I don't talk to him before the races. Like at the venue, I say, have fun out there. So, we don't talk about the strategy. That happens before. In practice, months before, in the training camp, maybe a couple days before, or, something like that.
The last thing related to perspective is that results don't necessarily happen right away. This is a great clip from Bob talking about waiting for the results to happen with the breaststroke kick.
He had never been ranked in breaststroke, and our goal for his 11, 12 years was be ranked in either the 100 or the 50 breast in the 11, 12 top 16. And we worked and we worked and we worked and we worked, and he never got ranked in the top 16. However, when Michael turned 14, he was ranked number 1 in the 200-meter breaststroke. So the process was happening. It just took longer than we thought. And when you're ranked number 1 in an event in the United States, you're pretty good at it. And that was his 4th best event by a far margin. We knew he was going to go on to do something really great.
Something that's also important with athletes and coaches is transparency. So the more transparent you can be as a coach, the more you can treat your athletes like responsible adults, assuming they are, the more you can get out of them. So something that I really took away when I was studying Tiger Woods is his dad, Earl, treated Tiger like an equal, like an adult, pretty much all of the time. He gave Tiger autonomy to make his own mistakes, and then Tiger learned from them. Having too tight a leash on the athletes or hiding information from them isn't always good. And I think that coaches can really benefit from not necessarily sugarcoating things, but being honest with what's going on. This is an example. If I want the Michigan job, it's mine, he said. I told him I wasn't surprised, and I congratulated him. Then he asked the obvious question. If I took the job, what would you do? I answered him in about 2 seconds. But I knew the question was coming, and I had my answer ready before he even asked. Are you kidding? I would go anywhere you would be, I told him. I like new challenges, and I used to wear a Michigan cap at school. So Bob lets Michael know that this is part of his process, and he lets Michael be involved in the decision-making of him going from North Baltimore to Michigan. He could have just taken the job. He could have decided and tried to ease Michael around. He's very direct with Michael in this circumstance. Come on, Bob, my mom said. She was in education. She saw kids every day. Michael's just a kid, she said. We don't know how he's going to change when the hormones kick in, when he wants to hang out with other kids in high school. That's why we're talking now, Bob said. Michael could be the real deal. I don't know when, he said, but he could if everyone here is willing to make the commitment. And he added, if he truly, genuinely loves it. Bob talked about where they might send me to high school, what the schedule of a typical day might look like, and what sorts of sacrifices I would have to make, that we would all have to make. For one, he said, Michael ought to stop playing other sports. That was big. His concern was not just the time that other sports were taking away from practice in the pool. It was that I'd get hurt playing something else. Because I was so energetic, I would bounce from sport to sport to sport. I was the kid with a stick in his hand, a glove, a ball, whatever. One particular afternoon when I was 9 stretched into evening, then into night, all of it around sports. I went first to a lacrosse game where I was told the coach that I could only play the first 3 quarters, then to the baseball field where I'd been selected for the home run derby, then to the pool for practice until after it got dark outside. He also told my parents, this has to be normal. Don't talk about anything that you don't normally talk about. We're just going to enjoy the sport of swimming, and then we're going to see where it takes us. So Bob is very upfront with Michael and his parents about the sacrifice, the commitment, the expectations. And it's up to Michael and his parents to decide if that's something that they want to be involved in. He also is honest about the long-term success of this, is that he thinks that this is a possibility, but it's only a possibility if certain things happen. Then it's up to the athlete, up to the family to decide if this is worth it. If the family just said, we're doing this, and Michael wasn't involved, Michael would have a lot of ammunition to stop doing it. If it's his choice, he's bought into it, then it's a lot more likely that he is willing to go down this path and he understands all the aspects of this. This is a great example of how Bob is getting buy-in from some of his swimmers at ASU.
This decision allowed them a lot of flexibility about where they train, how they train. Some are staying home and training because they're in very good situations. Some have come later. Some came right away. So they had that piece of the puzzle where we could be maximum flexibility in terms of, where they train because of their academic avenues that we have. So they could choose from the things that they and their families thought was best. So that was the first step. The second step was we feel like our team was just about to break through. Our men went in seated 7th, right? We had 2 top 3 relays. 2 of those guys were seniors, and we don't want them to lose a chance to really do something when it matters. So giving them an extra year of development is a very good thing. And honestly, giving our whole team an extra year of development is not a bad thing.
So all of these roles that a coach could play. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just the ones that I've seen so far in my research. I'm more than happy to explore more of these if people are interested. All of these are predicated on having a proper and effective communication with your athlete. So as we just mentioned, transparency is one way that is a good way to communicate with your athletes. There's also a few different ways that I want to highlight that communicating with an athlete could help them in their endeavors. So the first is encouragement. I think that this is really important. A lot of the time we talk about, especially with Bob Bowman, about how he's criticizing or giving feedback, but encouragement is also really important. Michael says, when I was behind the blocks, he'd ask me what time I was shooting for. If I didn't reach my goal time, I would always count on him to say, "Oh, so close, you'll get it next time." Whenever he said that, I always figured he knew what he was talking about, and it gave me a lot of confidence. Also, something that is really important in communication is using present language. So each time Bob sort of deflected the conversation, telling me that I was doing well and that we're taking care of other things. He didn't want my mind getting carried away about the future. So future planning, I think, is really important, but that's a lot of the time for the coach to do. With the athlete, you want to talk about things in the present. You want to deflect from the future to focus on the now. And this is a very unique way that Bob did that. On the front lawn, Michael's mom had placed a large banner with the word "congratulations" on it and trimmings around the lawn in red, white, and blue. I thought it looked great. Bob grabbed all of it and took it down. My mom was pretty upset with Bob when she came home a little while later. "Bob, do you realize what he just accomplished?" "Debbie, this is like step number 180 in a 10,000 step process. We're just getting started here." They compromised and left the sign up for 48 hours. I never saw the other decorations again. Bob asked my mom for her help in not letting people get too excited and keeping people's expectations in check. He decreed that nobody around Meadowbrook would say the word Olympic in my presence. So he didn't want to get his hopes up about qualifying for the Olympics. He also didn't want Michael to get overexcited about winning a medal in the Olympics. There's so much that has to be done between qualifying and winning a medal. There's so much that has to be done in terms of work that if you start thinking too far in the future, you start celebrating the results before they happen, you lose sight of the process at hand. And the messaging around that, I think, is really important. You shouldn't necessarily be talking about kids winning a tennis tournament or any of these types of things. You're worried about how they're behaving on the way up. You're worrying about their practice. You're worrying about the controllable things, not the uncontrollable things, which are wins. Another example from that time period. My mom told me about it and I wanted to go, but Bob said, "No, you're not on the team yet," he told me. "Don't get ahead of yourself." I made it pretty clear that I was disappointed. "Michael, the way you'll give yourself the best chance to go to Sydney is by staying here and training." So there was I believe it was a pre-Olympics get together where prospective athletes would be able to go. Bob says, "You're not going until you actually, your time is better spent training than doing this." This is Michael about how Bob and his family avoided saying Olympics around him.
You don't want to put all of these things in your head, because if all of the pieces aren't in place, then it's not going to happen the right way, right? So he was still trying to figure out how the pieces fit into the puzzle for me, but on the outside chance that everything goes well, I could be on the Olympic team. So we didn't want to jinx anything, and we can't do anything without the work, right? We're unable to get any of the results that we had in the pool without what happens behind closed doors, right? When Bob and I are training 4 hours a day, that's what helps me. That's what prepares me. That's what gives me the confidence to go and stand behind the block and feel prepared and ready to go.
Staying in the present, I think, is a really interesting one, because there's a little bit of a conflict between having these big ambitions and staying in the present to begin with. I think having these big ambitions, it's really important for providing direction. But when you're setting these intermediary goals, those have to occupy your mind completely. You can't be thinking about standing on a podium or setting a world record or being the greatest of all time when you're performing or competing, or even when you're in the midst of practicing. You have to be focused on what's happening in the moment. And one of the best ways to convey that is through how you talk to your athletes. Another way of communicating effectively is by describing realistic possibilities. So Bob had told me before the race that I would have a chance to make up ground over the last 50 meters, but I needed to be within striking range at the third turn. Instead, I was fifth at the 150 wall. Ironically, my mom and Bob each told me the same thing, that they were preparing the "We Still Love You" speeches in their minds. Michael did end up going on to win that race. I think what's important here is Bob had set these expectations, and if they weren't met, he knew how to handle them. It works both for the athletes and for the coach as well. To anyone who would listen in 2004, Bob would say, remember, Michael is only 19. We don't know how good he is yet. We're going to try to do whatever we can to get him to deliver his best performances. That's all I can do, and that's all he can do. So in 2004, Michael won 6 gold medals and won 8 medals overall, but that didn't hit the goal of the 7 medals, the Mark Spitz's record that was still holding. In 2004, I think it's important that Bob notes that Michael is still very young. There's still a lot of swimming, a lot of career before him. There is still upside. It's not the end of his career. And to give Michael and to give other people that perspective is really important. One of the best examples of this, and I've hashed on this a little bit before, is Michael's dream. And this is Bob talking about his 3 minutes and 7 seconds dream.
But he's like, hey, I keep having this dream over and over. And I was like, do I really want to know? And he's like, yeah, it's a swimming dream. And I'm like, well, okay, what is it? And he says, I keep looking up at the scoreboard and it says 3:07. And honestly, just to get him out of my office, I said, well, that's probably your 300 split in the 400 IM. If you're going to go 4:03, you're going to finish in 56, be 3:07. Where was it? The hair stands up on the back of my neck right now when I tell you, you look up there, it was 3:07 flat, the 300 in Beijing.
Wow.
He was like living this stuff, breathing it.
He's able to convert this, again, dream that Michael is having into the realistic times that he could hit in the pool. And I think that that's a very important skill. How do you take this aspirational thing? How do you take this vision or these dreams or these goals and make them into concrete things? When it comes to communication, I think with coaches and with athletes, there is inevitably conflict. And figuring out how to handle and resolve conflict is really important. I think that there are right ways to do this and there are wrong ways to do this. We were bickering a lot in practice over seemingly little things. One Sunday, Bob came over to the house and we laced into one another. Mom listened for a while, then left, then came back and we were still arguing about commitment and direction in the pool and the attitude out of it. Both of us kicked furniture and threw books on the floor. It was bad. Bob decided we need to go for a ride and we headed to his sanctuary. Bob asked if I wanted to get on a horse and I told him it was one of the things that really freaked me out. Another, for some reason, is picking up somebody else's baby because I'm always afraid I'll drop it. Bob and I talked for hours and finally walked back into the house after dark, carrying McDonald's bags full of food. We didn't solve everything that day, but we understood how much we needed each other in order to succeed. So having tough conversations and facing them head on is something that I think is really important. A lot of athletes, a lot of coaches, for better or for worse, can be a little bit passive aggressive. And just getting to the point and having the conversations can be something that gets you through the thick of it. Even if things don't go well, even if you're shouting at each other, finding a way to remember that you're both hoping for the same thing, you're both aligned towards the same goal of making each other better is a good place to start. And then just spending time and getting through it rather than avoiding things and letting them fester. Facing things head on is really, really important. The idea of finding common ground is a really important thing. There's a great book, if you're interested in this aspect, called Crucial Conversations. I've read it quite a few times. It's helped me with my interpersonal relations with my friends and family, with coaches, with athletes that I work with. And I could not recommend it more. I could maybe do an in-depth breakdown of that in the future if that's something people are interested in. Another way that athletes and coaches can communicate effectively is if coaches and athletes know their specific roles. So a lot of this is focused on the coaches and the athletes' role, this entire podcast, but there's a specific role that a coach has at a specific moment. And I think it's important for them to remember that and not overshadow your athlete, not do a lot of these things. Michael says, I didn't realize Bob was being strategic. He knew that Jamie wasn't far away. So after he was done yapping at me, he went over to Jamie and started playing good cop, bad cop. Hey, Jamie, can you go over and talk to Michael? He said. I gave him some strong words and he's pretty down right now. What do you want me to tell him? Jamie asked. Tell him to keep his head up and that it was only one day and he's going to swim a great race tomorrow because he's done it before and he knows he can do it again. Just pick him up a little. That's pretty much what Jamie told me. It worked. So Bob knows in this case that he needed to be the authoritarian voice and that Jamie, who's another swimmer, could pick Michael up. Michael needed both of those things and Bob could only offer one. Something else that I thought was pretty funny is that Bob gets unbelievably nervous around races. It's not great for your coach to be transmitting those nerves to you. And Bob worked very hard not to transmit this nervousness. This is Bob talking about that.
You know, in Athens, Michael's first chance at a gold medal, that's the only time I've ever seen him nervous was before the 400 IM, literally in every race. And I saw a clip of that race not long ago, and they show me right before it. There's a camera like right in my face, and I'm smiling with John Urbanchek, and I'm literally making myself do that. And I remember in my head, I'm like, all I want to do is throw up right now.
The last thing I thought that was really interesting was communicating in your own language, speaking in code can be very effective. It can be effective for multiple reasons. One is you're creating a new bond by just speaking from the same common lexicon that only you understand. Think of a little kid where they have a made-up language with their friend. They become intimately closer because they have that shared connection. It can also serve to confuse opponents or to throw other people off, to be able to convey things so that other people don't pick up on it. If you remember, Kobe Bryant was speaking Italian or Spanish to his teammates, and that 100% messed with the opponents that he was playing. Michael says, when I swim, especially at meets, there's no way for a coach to scream above the din of noise so he can be understood. Instead, Bob will whistle in 4 or 5 different tones, and I'll try to carry out the directions encoded in his whistles. I can't describe exactly how each one is different from the others, but I can recognize each of them. There's a whistle that says, come on, pick it up. There's one that says, good job. Keep up the same pace. There's a whistle that says good, but give it some more tempo. And there is the half whistle, half slap of the hands that says, what the heck is up with you today? Get the gorilla off your back and start swimming. So I guess there's an additional competitive advantage here is that they can cut through the noise and they can communicate when other people cannot communicate because these meets are so noisy. There's some pretty good research about how shared language can foster a sense of community. I've seen this personally. I know, for example, in jiu-jitsu, there's a gym called 10th Planet, and they have different names for all of the same jiu-jitsu moves. So when you see 10th Planet competitors, our coaches are yelling things that are just nonsensical to people, but it makes sense to them. And that can be disorienting for the other jiu-jitsu competitor, but it can also be compelling because you're not getting confused by hearing the other coach because your language is completely different. I find these examples, language, communication, very, very interesting in terms of those communications. And being able to have your own language, even if it's small, even if it's just different ideas, really does help to ingrain these ideas as well. Another way that coaches can effectively communicate with athletes is by taking ownership in their speech. So it wasn't a pleasant call. I have bad news, I said. Oh God, he said. After that, he said, we really need to get our act together. We, meaning me. I know what I did was stupid, I said. I know I made a mistake. I can't change it. Ultimately, I underwent surgery. Doctors fixed the break with a titanium plate and 3 screws. Keenan did an amazing job helping me with the therapy. The scar was hardly noticeable. So this is when Michael, I believe, broke his wrist before the 2008 Olympics. There's a lot of good research around using we rather than I and taking accountability in for stakes. Effective coaches view the relationship as they're on the same team. Using we rather than I or you is a very, very compelling way to get buy-in and to empathize with your athletes as well. I'll leave that link in the description to the research associated with that. The last effective means of communication and role that a coach can take on is being the voice of reason. So a lot of the times, if something happens to an athlete, it can seem like the end of the world. Sometimes it takes a second or third party to weigh everything and provide a route forward. And in this case, in this example I'm going to give, this is something that Bob really helped with. In the fall of 2007, after dinner one night at Buffalo Wild Wings in Ann Arbor, one of those restaurants with a sports theme, I was walking to my car. As I neared it, walking on the driver's side, I slipped. I fell down and hit the ground. In reacting, you don't really have time to think in that kind of situation. I put my right hand down to cushion the fall. I caught myself, nothing hurt. Everything seemed all right. The next morning, Sunday, I woke up and it looked like there was a golf ball in my right wrist. I thought, this isn't good. This can't be good. This could be really bad. I knew right then that my wrist was cracked, fractured, broken. I started doing some quick math in my head. This was late October. The games were next August. 2 full months left in 2007, plus 7 months in 2008. Would I be there in time? Wait, the trials were at the end of June. 2 months in 2007, plus 6 months in 2008 to get ready. Would there be time? I was upset as I could be. I told Bob, I think I just gave away gold medals. I guess it was a good try, I said. I had a good run. I don't know how I'm going to be able to come back from this. Bob listened quietly. He said, the meet's not this week. Let's see how you can do. He also said, I was there for you in the beginning. I'm going to be there for you in the end. And however it ends up is how it ends up. After he hung up, I found out later that Bob was making soup and he threw it away. He had suddenly lost his appetite. There were two options. First, let it heal on its own, which would take a while. That's what most people do, the doctor said. Your hand would be in a cast for maybe 6 weeks, he said. I said, what's the other choice? Surgery, he said. The advantage of which would be the bone would be put back into place and then there would be a pin, and you'd simply wait for the stitches to come out. About 10 days, he said. That was a no-brainer. Surgery it was. You're talking only one pin, Bob said, mindful that the prior break had involved 3 screws and a plate. Meanwhile, Bob heard 10 days and thought, okay, maybe this isn't the end of the world. What my clumsiness had done, he had made clear, was eliminate my margins. Before the break, I had maybe some wiggle room in my schedule. Now, I could have none. You can still do this, Bob told me, but are you ready to listen? Yes. Starting now, he said, you're going to have to do every single thing that I ask you to do. You're going to have to do it my way. I thought to myself, this is not going to be fun, but it's not what I said. Okay, I said, I'll do it. We had gone to the doctor in the morning. That afternoon, per Bob's instructions, I was on the stationary bike. For me, riding the stationary bike is one of the most boring activities imaginable. It's horrible. One of the worst things I've ever done. Some people think swimming is boring or monotonous. Not me. Swimming is fun. Riding a stationary bike is the least amount of fun possible. The thing is, though, I knew I needed to keep working out. The bike was making my legs stronger. Much as I didn't want to do it, I did. It was the right thing to do. I'd given Bob my word. In a weird way, the broken wrist gave me an urgency that in the long run turned out to be a positive. So if you look at this example, obviously a lot in there, but Bob is able to frame this as something that, one, isn't the end of the world. He's able to help Michael make decisive action and get back to all of their goals. Obviously, it's very scary for Michael. He's spiraling a little bit. He thinks he's given up gold medals, but Bob is able to use logic, to use timing, and think about this critically, and they're able to put together a game plan that works really well. He's also able to motivate Michael in a really unique way to say, hey, you're going to have to do it this way if you want to achieve this. You made a little stumble here, but this isn't the end of the world. We just have to recommit and we have to keep going. I think that this is a masterclass in communication and also in being able to persuade someone to get the results that they want. This wouldn't be possible at all, though, without trust. Before I focus on the section on trust, I think that this is a really funny quote. So Bob has named one of his horses after Pete, Michael's agent, and Michael wants to know why he didn't name a horse after Michael. Hey, Bob, I've been with you longer than Pete. How come you didn't name a horse after me? Bob said, Michael, that's a lot of pressure to put on a horse. That's a lot to live up to. Michael said, Bob, it's a horse. Think he knows the difference? Well, it's polite, obedient, and a well-behaved horse. When I find one who bites me, I'll call him Phelps. So obviously, I think that is like a fun way to end the section on communication. Obviously, they can have some digs at each other. They can have this conflicting relationship, but it nets out to be a very positive relationship because of a lot of the trust, the approach they have to communication, and the straightforwardness of what they do. They also have those aligned incentives. So what makes trust? I found a pretty interesting article. It's a Harvard Business Review that talks about the neuroscience of trust. And I just want to go through some of the aspects of it, not in too much depth, but to just get you thinking about how to build trust with athletes a little more effectively. All of these other aspects are predicated on building trust to begin with. So the first thing is recognizing excellence. So with your athletes, do you recognize that they have potential? Do you even want to work with them if they don't have potential? That's one question. But the other side of that is potential doesn't just come in athletic prowess. Potential can come in hard work, in understanding, in grit, in a lot of these other areas, and recognizing and rewarding a lot of the hard work that athletes put in is really important. The next thing is introducing challenge stress. So we talked about creating adversity, being able to create crucibles for your athletes to go through and for them to succeed in them. If you're a partner in these things, that can be a very powerful thing. I know that I had a lot of respect, and a lot more respect for coaches that really went through things with me, that did the hard work with me and show that they were also putting in the effort to overcome these challenges. The next thing is also enabling autonomy. So if we're thinking about, for example, Bob giving Michael the ability and option to choose to do more butterfly practice, that's an example of that. Giving an athlete time to work on their own or giving them the opportunity to give feedback is really important. The next thing is transparency. We just had a whole section on transparency, but being straight up and honest with athletes, I think, is really important. You can be honest without shutting the door on ambitions. I mean, obviously, no coaches, no athletes really know what the future will hold. So it's kind of foolish to write anything off, but it is reasonable to be honest with certain expectations. The next part is relationship building, doing things outside of the sport, sharing things that are not necessarily related to the sport, whether it's personal life, whether it's guidance, whether it's the frameworks like Bob has imparted to Michael and the other athletes. And that ties into facilitating the whole growth of an individual person. So helping them with, it could be life advice, it could be things that they struggle with outside of the game, it could be even mental models that work within the game that extend to real life. I think teaching resilience is something that sports do in an incredible way. And if you can help someone learn resilience in sports, they can transfer that beyond there. And then the last thing about building trust is also showing vulnerability. Coaches are not flawless. They are not perfect. If you mess up, owning up to it, being honest when something doesn't go your way, I think that that's something that is really hard for a lot of coaches to do. They view themselves as a person of power and authority, and they think showing any vulnerability will be a negative or make people lose respect for them. That tends to be the opposite with actually building trust. So this is Michael on what made him trust Bob.
And if I look back to that moment when I trusted him at 11, I think it was almost really, I was looking for somebody who had confidence in me, and like a father figure who had confidence in me. And he showed that. My father was very absent at that time in my life, and my coach stepped in and he just believed that I could do whatever I wanted. And for me, I was like, all right, cool. Like, let's do it. Like, he would say jump and I would say how high at that point, so I still remember some of the sets that we did as a kid. And it's mind blowing to me now. And he just got me to that point. And I said, okay, well, what's next?
So we talked a ton about the role of the coach. I think it's important for us to end with what is the role of the athlete in all this. This is the Exponential Athlete Podcast. After all, it is not the Exponential Coach. Although I think athletes understanding coaches better and coaches understanding athletes better is a really, really important thing. And that's why I thought it was important to put this whole thing together. So what are some of the things that I think athletes should be responsible for that can also be helped and facilitated by the coaches? Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is really what came to mind as I was going through this research, especially as it relates to Michael Phelps and Bob Bowman. So the first is setting goals. So Bob, in a lot of cases, helped Michael to set the framework for goal setting, but coming up with the individual goals, coming up with a vision, coming up with what you want to get out of frankly life and your sport is something that you should be responsible for as an athlete. The next is bringing the right attitude and mindset, showing up excited about working every day, even if it's difficult, showing up, being willing to push through difficulty. Those are things that I think is a prerequisite in being a great athlete. The idea that you're coming in with creativity, you're willing to think about problems, you're not just looking for answers from a coach, is also something. Athletes should also be comfortable taking on risk. I think part of an attitude is risk tolerance and understanding that you might get worse before you get better. And that's an inevitable part of getting better. The idea that you're also going to lose, and losing is going to help you to get better in the long run. Part of resiliency to loss is positivity. I don't think everyone has to be completely 100% positive all the time, but I think positivity is something that is very important, or maybe not positivity, optimism is something that's really important in aspiring athletes. The next part is to actually trust the coach and trust the process if it's earned. So the coach obviously has to earn the trust of the athlete, but it is the job of the athlete, if you've chosen this coach, to fully commit to what they're teaching. You can't sort of be wishy-washy and half in and half out. If you have any issues with what your coach is presenting to you, you should have a communication about it, and you should be able to hash out and eventually get on the same page. Again, part of that is asking questions and pushing back if you do not understand. I've been in plenty of circumstances, I've seen it multiple times, where an athlete doesn't really understand what the coach is saying, and they're intimidated or they don't want to look silly, and they aren't willing to push back so that they fully understand. Coaches are there, or good coaches are there to help teach, to help educate, to help mentor. And if you don't understand something, it's better to hash it out and look a little stupid in the short term than to wait in the long term and make a mistake and really get scrutinized or put pressure on you. After that, something that we've studied a lot in historic athletes is doing your homework and learning on your own. So obviously in this section, Michael said he didn't really love to read that much, but I guarantee you he studied the heck out of Ian Thorpe. He studied so many other swimmers. He was constantly thinking about swimming, trying to learn, trying to evolve. Kobe was constantly looking at historic basketball players. He was studying Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, all of these athletes to try to become better. That's something that I think every athlete needs to do. If you're here and you're an athlete, I think that you're really on the right track. We're going more in depth into these topics than I think pretty much any other podcast that I'm familiar with. After that, the athlete's role is to show up. So consistent effort, showing up every day with a good attitude is something that takes you very far. After showing up, putting in the work is pretty obvious. I think that just showing up is one thing. Putting your best effort forward, even when you don't feel like it, is also a very important thing. You're not always going to have your best practices. You're not always going to do your best work. But the idea is that you're putting in your best effort to do that. The results don't always match effort, but if you're consistently putting in this work over time, they eventually match up very well. And then the last responsibility of an athlete, I think, is to recover and rest. A lot of the times, there's a lot of competing incentives, especially if you're a high-powered athlete. There's parties, there's celebrity, there's a lot of options for stuff that you can do in your downtime. But if you want to maximize your performance in sport, it's important to give your body the rest and recovery that it needs. It's important to make some form of sacrifice to be able to work at the highest level that you can do. I think that there's also absolutely some elements of taking care of your mind, having outside interests, being able to find some balance in your life. I'm going to try to get into more of those in part 4, which is focused on athletes and mental health. So in this episode, we covered a lot. So we covered the role of a coach. We covered effective communication in athletes. We covered how to build trust with athletes. And then we covered and took a deep dive into the role of an athlete. I really hope you found this useful. Again, part 4 is focused on some of the mental health struggles that Michael Phelps had, how he was able to work through them and hopefully resolve them over time. We're also going to talk about Michael's family and some of the ways that they supported him through all of this. If you enjoyed this, if you found this useful, please leave a rating on the show. It's one of the best ways to perpetuate the podcast. If you have a friend who's an athlete, a coach who might find this useful, please forward this along. Lastly, please reach out on social media. Let me know how I can improve the podcast. Let me know if there's other athletes or topics you'd like me to study. I'm available on Instagram, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. Also, I recently started a newsletter. I will leave those all in the description and the show notes. Until next time, let's pursue excellence together.